Hello, BookTube, and welcome back belatedly to the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. For March, we are reading The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, the third installment in her Thomas Cromwell trilogy about King Henry VIII's low-born but extremely nouveau riche, thuggish leg breaker, Thomas Cromwell, who in Mantel's imagining is not that. She imagines him as a combination of Martin Luther King and Jesus Christ himself. She imagines him as an enlightened man, a thoughtful man, a caring man, someone who believes in universal work programs for the dignity of man, who believes in uplifting the poor, who believes in rational humanistic thought, and is only occasionally driven to brutality. He's only occasionally driven to the occasional brutal act. This is a long book. This is by far the longest of the three Cromwell books. And I mentioned at the beginning of our read-along for this book that entices Mantel to indulge herself. And those indulgences can sometimes have the appearance of longueurs, of long dull patches. I say have the appearance of those dull patches because I rejoice in her prose so much that I wouldn't mind if this thing were twice as long. I wouldn't mind if there had been 10 more volumes in this, if she'd done every year of Cromwell's life, once he came to power, per book. But she doesn't do that. We are hurtling for, it doesn't feel it at times, especially in the chapters that we're reading today, but we are hurtling towards the finish here. And the finish of the book is the finish of Cromwell's life. These are narrated closely from his point of view. When he's dead, the book is over. As we'll see. We'll get to that part in our next chapter, or the one after that. I'm not 100% sure. I think we have 2 more installments to go. We'll take 2 more installments anyway. But in the chapters that we're reading today, this is where the book is most vulnerable to the accusation that an editor could have leaned more heavily on it. This is twice the size of Wolf Hall. And these chapters are the ones where someone could read them and say, well, this is why it's twice as long. It's not because it needs to be. It's because you have long sections like this. I can kind of, sort of agree. On the surface, anyway, very little happens in these chapters. Cromwell is done with one of his main projects, which is to work the long, slow years of web weaving necessary to destroy the 4 men who took part in a play mocking the downfall of Thomas Cromwell's beloved mentor, Cardinal Wolsey. And he does do that. We are led to believe, at least if you read between the lines in the mirror, in the Bring Up the Bodies, we are led to believe that the reason why the particular men were named in Anne Boleyn's trial as being her lovers is because they were those men, not because they were her lovers. And that Cromwell was just slowly, inexorably working their downfall. In order to do that, he needed the connivance, he needed the support of some of the most powerful families in the country. The old families in the country, the ones from Plantagenet blood, who view Henry Tudor, the second of that name, as a parvenu, as a new blood and definitely not worthy of the throne. They can't come right out and say that, but they work with, the old families work with Cromwell to bring down Anne Boleyn because she is the spawn of a new family, of the Boleyn family. But they don't like Cromwell. They know exactly who he is, and they don't like him. And in these chapters, Cromwell begins to work the downfall of 2 big families, the Poles and the Courtenays. In fact, he does work their downfall. Now, part of that work is spurred by Reginald Pole, who has Plantagenet blood flowing bright blue in his veins and is not daring to set foot in England, but is denouncing Henry as the Antichrist from the continent. And Henry is maddened by this. This man's an English citizen. He should be, surely Cromwell can either get him back to England to face the king in person, or get some people over to the continent to kill him in a back alley, in a tavern, in a monk's cell, whatever it needs to be to shut his mouth. Cromwell can't quite do that, but he can do everything else. All the other Poles live in England. He can strike at them. And he begins to do that. Same thing with the Courtenay family. He doesn't like these people, and they don't like him. That makes the task a little easier. That's one of the things that's going on in these chapters. It's slow, and it's in the background mostly. It's it's difficult. It's one of the places in this book that is, I said at the beginning of this read along for this month, that you could jump right into this book without reading the other two books. These chapters are going to strain that more than anything else, because it's the earlier books that will give these momentum. And the same thing is true of the other main thing that happens in these chapters, which is religious. Keep in mind here, this is one of the anachronisms of these books. You have to keep in mind that there was a raging religious war going on here about the Reformed Church. And Cromwell was at the heart of it. Even people who, like myself, squint at the historical record and don't consider him to be a good guy. Not at all. Not at all. The old families hated him because he was a jumped-up nobody, but he was also eminently hateable on his own for the way he treated people, and not just old money. But in these books, he is also a passionate believer in the reform of the church, in putting the gospel into plain English so that the plowboy can read it at his plow, so that anybody can read it. In the first two books in this series, Cromwell is pretty free in private, or at least what he thinks is private, with the reason why the established church would not want that to happen. As he puts it over and over again, if you could read it in English, if you can't read any other language, and you finally read it in English instead of hearing it chanted in Latin that you can't understand by a priest who's got his back to you, if you could read it in English, as he says over and over again, you'd be amazed at what's in it, and you'd be even more amazed at what's not in it, what things aren't there. It's central, of course, to Cromwell's whole life. Henry is a very religious person, also extremely religiously knowledgeable. And he needs to believe that his abominable behavior to his wife and also to Anne Boleyn is scripturally justified. He needs to believe that he warrants the title that was given to him by the Pope, Defender of the Faith. So that element has to be here. And it's the set piece of these pages. Because there's a man named John Lambert who also took the name John Nicholson. And he's a furtive, pathetic figure, and he challenges the king. He's arrested, of course, by Cromwell, by the state apparatus, and he challenges the king to debate theology with him, to debate whether or not he's wrong in the things that he's been preaching that would otherwise merit his death. And the king agrees. Henry agrees. It's a wonderfully drawn scene. He shows up all dressed in white like a moving mountain covered in snow, Mantell says, and he needs no counselors. He calls on them from time to time, but he doesn't need them. He can quote chapter and verse of the Bible himself. He can justify all sorts of things scripturally himself. He's extremely well learned, with that weird Tudor memory that never fails and that can please as much as torment the possessor. In the trial sequence that Mantell gives us, Lambert is flounging right from the beginning. He is flummoxed by the fact that, as one person talking to Cromwell at the time says, it seems to bother the king more that he has two names than anything that he's saying about Scripture. Lambert is overawed and flummoxed right from the beginning, and a number of different celebrated divines stand up. They have a program. They have their turns to take their whack at this guy, to show him the error of his ways. Cromwell in the scene is noticeably silent. When it's his turn, he says, I believe that everyone else has spoken and just fine. He doesn't go at the guy himself, when in the past we have seen that he has no compunction about doing that in other cases. The inevitable conclusion that we draw, and that most of the observers, especially the ones that hate Cromwell, draw, is that he agrees with Lambert. Mostly agrees with him. Mostly disagrees with the king. In a lot of subjects, on a lot of religious grounds. Nevertheless, Mantell gives us an odd little apostrophe of Cromwell praising Henry as a result of this all-day-long theological contest. She has Cromwell think about Henry's fellow monarchs, Francis I and the Holy Roman Emperor. Cromwell says, you would not hear Francois engage with a subject in close debate, nor would he be capable of it. You would not find the emperor fighting to save the life of a miserable subject. They would bring in their inquisitors and break Lambert in the torture room. I'm not quite sure why Mantell has her Cromwell say these things. I think it's, once again, an effort on her part to sort of pull herself away, no Reginald pull, but with a pull, to sort of edge herself away from what she knows better than anybody, except maybe Dermot McCullough, is the real Cromwell. The real Cromwell broke plenty of people in the torture room. Plenty of them. The real Cromwell would have known that this was all theater. That this whole debate was all theater. It was meant for onlookers. It wasn't meant for Lambert. There was no chance that Lambert was ever going to walk out arm in arm with the king. There was no chance that Lambert was ever going to be able to say, well, I repent and escape death. No chance of that at all. This was an exercise in egotism on Henry's part, but the barbaric end was never in doubt. And it isn't in doubt. Henry eventually says, I won't have a heretic. I won't be ruler over a heretic. Take him away. And we are told that Lambert is an hour dying. Burned to death. That's horrifying. It's described in other instances. It's described in other times in Cromwell's story, not in this book, but in earlier books, most memorably in Wolf Hall, when a very, very young Thomas Cromwell sees a woman burned to death, watches the whole thing. When he's just a boy, he's there in the crowd, and he watches her burned to death, and more than that, when it's all over, the crowd is dispersed and everyone's gone, he's still hanging around, and he watches her furtive friends, her fellow believers, come forward and trowel up her remains. One of them actually turns to him, just a grown woman to a little boy. She turns to him and says, this was her name. Cromwell remembers all of that. He remembers everything about this whole religious aspect of the story. The point that I'm getting at here is that Mantell can't have him be culpable, even in moments like this, when he was most certainly culpable. It's, I think, beyond a shadow of a doubt that Cromwell arranged this whole farce. Either way, Lambert dies. He takes a long time to die, but he dies. And Cromwell is conferring after this with Bishop Cranmer. And Cranmer says, if the king can burn this man, he can burn us. Cromwell says, we may talk about all this liturgical stuff, but in this instance we failed. We should have been able to save this man. And when Cranmer says that, the king can burn this man, he can burn us. If you know anything about Tudor history, you automatically think of Cranmer's end. Of course, he will have the same end. The same horrible, squalid, screaming, bleeding, burning end. The same hour. The same miserable hour. Maybe on some level Cromwell thinks it might come for him as well. There's evidence, I think, in the historical record that Cromwell was very much working behind Henry's back, doing all sorts of things, especially on the religious front, that Henry would not have authorized, did not know about, did not approve. Of course, Cromwell doesn't know the end is coming. He says again in these chapters that he doesn't think he'll make old bones, but he wonders what his old age will be like. When we know, if you just look at Wikipedia, you'll know he doesn't have long to live. He's in the last years of his life. He's not going to burn to death, but this is a case that could have been made. That fate could have been his. And that's really it in this chapter. There's that weird bit where Mantell has Cromwell extol Henry in some odd way, in a way that at that moment, Cromwell would certainly not have been thinking that. He might have been impressed by Henry's performance, but he wouldn't have been thinking in terms of other monarchs, much less in terms of the Inquisition. And there's another moment in these chapters where Cromwell does the same sort of thing. He's remembering a scene that we saw earlier where Henry is stricken while on the tilting yard, and he's lying unconscious. Everyone thinks he's dead. And Cromwell shows up at the last minute. He is. Someone runs to get him at his office, and he's told the king is dead. He goes rushing, and in that moment, that scene that he's recalling, he's rushing to the location of where the king is, but the thought crosses his mind that maybe instead of doing that, he should rush for the ports and make his escape. We know from these chapters that he has money sequestered overseas. And he knows that he's surrounded by enemies. As he says much, much earlier in the book, I'm a man who can say that his only friend is the King of England. The old families hate him. The new families hate him. Everyone hates him. I would argue there's a reason for that. You'll never get the reason in these books. For a split second, he thinks, maybe instead of running to the king's dead body, I should be running to the nearest port, because they might still not be on the alert for me. I might be able to get out alive. those instincts abandon him. The instinct to guess whether or not he's in mortal danger abandons him. We can see little hints in every chapter, little hints growing. He records them faithfully. Mantell has him record everything that he sees and suspects faithfully, but he's not putting the pieces together the way we can. But at one point, in these chapters, he's remembering that whole incident with Henry. Cromwell walks into the tent where Henry's body is laid out, strikes him on the chest, tells him to live, has no idea that what he's doing. But Henry does recover. He does take in a gasp of breath. And we get a weird moment. I wrote it down. After a second, Henry gasped. He groaned. He coughed violently and uttered, "Thomas Cromwell." The shocked lords wailed, lie down, but Henry levered himself upright. His eyes turned and took in the scene. Alive again, he looked at England. He saw her dark valleys and green fields, her broad silver waters, her nightingale woods. He saw her just laws, her free people. He heard their prayers. I honestly don't know where a passage like that comes from. At the moment, what Henry did was lean over and throw up. He wasn't thinking of the just laws of England. He wasn't hearing any prayers. Couldn't pick a nightingale. Couldn't tell you the difference between a nightingale and a rooster in the barnyard. It's weird that would be in the book. It's also weird that in this moment, it almost seems like Mantell is breaking her own rule and telling us what Henry was feeling instead of what Cromwell thought Henry was feeling. It's odd, and I wonder if that and the other bit, the bit about negotiating with a servant to save his life, aren't in here to play up the contrast between Cromwell's certainty in Henry and the fate that is going to come to him at the hands of Henry in very little time. It isn't smallpox or an enemy's dagger that's going to take Cromwell down. It's going to be an order from King Henry, the very man that Cromwell is lavishing praise on in these chapters that we're reading today. That's the only from a writer's perspective, that's the only reason I can think of why you would load these things in. We already know from these chapters that Henry is not pleased with Cromwell, specifically in terms of Reginald Pole. He wants Reginald Pole either dead or delivered to England, and he can't get either one. He's constantly tasking Cromwell with that. He's also not happy with the progress of religion in the country, and a few other things. Wasn't totally happy with the Pilgrimage of Grace. It's tense, but it's still friendly. Henry is telling Cromwell, you're assuring him over and over again, I may put you down or berate you in front of others, but it's Henry and Cromwell. Henry and Cromwell, that's just for show. I trust you completely. So we're going to move on. We're going to find that's not true. We're going to move on. So for next time, we are going to read part 5. So we have 2 installments left of this book club for this month. So next we'll read part 5 for the Indian subcontinent only edition. That is from page 629 to page 719. Not a heavy burden for 1 week's reading. So we'll do that for next time. And I also want to make a brief inclusion here. I'll make a separate video doing the announcement, but for those of you watching, you might want a little bit of an extra time to prepare for our next book, for the book that we'll be doing in April. Which is this. It's Bettany Hughes' book, The Hemlock Cup, all about Socrates and ancient Athens. I don't know how readily available it is. I'd be happy to look for a copy for you. And I just wanted to briefly mention this here. You don't have to care. I will make a separate video. You don't have to keep it in mind. But I thought maybe some of you might be going out to library book sales or making a rare trip to your used bookstore, something like that. You might want to keep an eye out for it. So that's going to be next. That's going to be April. But anyway, that's it for The Mirror and the Light. This is a bit of a slow segment. We're going to move on next time, see what jumps out as then. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.